in this three-part video series, we're going to be looking at the functions of the three primary regulatory hormones of the digestive system, starting with the regulatory hormone gastrin, which is the primary hormone that regulates the activation and inactivation of the stomach. Now, if we think about the primary functions of the stomach, that being the digestion of protein, the digestion of protein requires two components. Number one, it requires a high concentration of HCl, which is required to denature proteins in order to make them easier to digest in the stomach, and a high concentration of HCl corresponds to a low pH, meaning increasingly acidic conditions. Secondly, protein requires a digestive enzyme, which of course is pepsinogen, or at least the inactive form is, in order to be broken down. And we know that pepsinogen, although this is the inactive form, in the presence of a high concentration of hydrochloric acid, activates and therefore becomes pepsin, and therefore gastrin regulates both of these activities. Now, whenever we discuss how hormones work, the first thing that we need to talk about is what we call a stimulus, which is any type of environmental factor that activates the hormone, and the gastrin in particular actually has three. The first of which is what we call the parasympathetic response from the brain. And the parasympathetic response goes by another name that we have mentioned previously, what we call the rest and the digest response. Now, the parasympathetic response activates generally whenever the brain recognizes that food has been put into the digestive system. The parasympathetic response is triggered, and this is what causes your mouth to salivate every time you put food in your mouth, or even at the scent of food. And all of this is your brain simply redirecting the body's energy reserves in order to favor the digestive system. And this is the first stimulus that tells cells in your stomach and also in the duodenum to produce a protein hormone called gastrin, which then goes to the stomach in order to activate it. But we can take a look at this in more detail once we find the next two stimuli. Now, remember that the primary goal of the stomach is the digestion of protein, so naturally gastrin is going to be produced when there is a high concentration of protein that is detected within the stomach, because that's a signal to the stomach that digestion needs to begin. The third stimulus, which doesn't seem to be related at first, is a condition called hypercalcemia, and if we look at the root of this word here, that's probably an indication that we're looking for the element calcium, which exists as an ion when dissolved in water, so we write calcium as Ca2+. Now, what exactly does this have to do with the stomach and with protein? Well, if we think about where calcium comes from, one of the primary locations that calcium comes from is bones, and since meat is a very rich source of calcium, meat most likely gets its high source of calcium because of the fact that meat is usually attached to bones, and some of the calcium from the bones would actually end up in the meat when the meat is cooked. Another example of very calcium-rich and very protein-rich food is any product that is based on dairy is a rich source of calcium, and of course there are many proteins that exist in milk-based products as well. Either way, both of these stimuli indicate to the stomach that there is a high volume of protein present, and therefore the stomach needs to get busy in order to actually break down this protein. So regardless of which of the three stimuli trigger the stomach and the duodenum to produce gastrin, gastrin is produced by cells in these two locations and then travels to specific cells in the stomach that are responsible for acid and pepsinogen production and activates both of them. So the first thing that is obviously released into the cells of the stomach is pepsinogen, because ultimately this digestive enzyme is going to be used in order to break down protein. So this is the first substance that cells in the stomach produce when gastrin activates them. But of course, we know that pepsinogen is inactive, and therefore we're going to need to be able to switch it on, and that requires acid. So the second way the second effect rather that gastrin has on our stomach cells is that it triggers the cells of the stomach to start producing special transport proteins that allow acid to be pumped into the stomach, and these are what we call H plus K plus pumps. Now, as a little bit of background, remember that whenever we reference H plus, we are referring to acid, because HCl, when it is ionized in water, or when it is dissolved in water, the water causes HCl to ionize, giving us H plus ions and Cl minus ions. So whenever we see H plus being referred to, this is telling us that we're dealing with acid. So these transportation proteins are ultimately what allow the stomach, in order to pump acid into the inside of the stomach, because it takes the H plus ions that come from HCl from inside of the stomach cells and pump them into the stomach where the protein is found. And when this acid enters the stomach, this allows the acid to denature the protein in our food and ultimately activate pepsinogen into pepsin so that it can be digested rather. Now, the way that these transport proteins work is that they take acid from the inside of our stomach cells and potassium ions from inside of our stomach. So these potassium ions would actually come from potassium-rich food and pump them into the stomach. And the end result of this is the acidification of the stomach, which again we would measure as a decrease in pH, meaning that a greater amount of acid is present in the stomach, which again allows the protein in our food to be denatured, making it easier to break down, and therefore activating pepsinogen and turning it into the active form pepsin to allow this protein to be chemically digested. Now, the final characteristic we need to talk about whenever we talk about regulatory hormones is how to shut this whole process off. Now, obviously, we are not eating 100% of the time, every second of every day. So, eventually, all of the protein in our food is going to be digested, and at that point, we do not want the stomach to remain on. And therefore, once the concentration of HCl, or the concentration of acid within the stomach, gets high enough, this actually acts as an emergency shutoff signal for the stomach, because once again, once a critical volume of acid in the stomach is reached, this acid then becomes dangerous because it can actually dissolve the mucus layer on the walls of your stomach and ultimately lead to damage to the stomach walls, and this is something that we want to prevent. So what this means is the more H plus, or again, remember whenever we refer to H plus, this is talking about acid. So the more hydrochloric acid that is found within the stomach, eventually this is going to trigger the inhibition of gastrin, meaning that the cells in the stomach that produce this regulatory hormone, gastrin, are going to be stopped so that no more gastrin is produced anymore, and therefore these cells that actually pump acid within the stomach no longer do so, meaning that no acid any longer enters the stomach, therefore shutting off the entire process. And once the protein in the stomach is digested, that's a signal for the muscles in the stomach to contract and push all of the partially digested food and acid out of the stomach, allowing it to empty, therefore resetting the stomach to when it was inactive. So, in other words, if we look at this process, gastrin triggers the pumping of acid into the stomach, but the more acid enters the stomach, the more likely this acid will actually inhibit the whole process. So what we have here is yet another example of feedback inhibition, which we also saw is a way to inhibit the activity of pepsin itself, because the more protein that is digested, the more amino acids will be floating around, and the more likely those amino acids can shut off pepsin and prevent it from digesting the walls of the stomach. Now, the second way that gastrin can be shut off is actually with the next regulatory hormone in the sequence of the digestive system, which is a regulatory hormone that we call secretin, which is the primary regulatory hormone that regulates one of the functions of the pancreas and also the subject of the next video in this series.